The wind howled across the desolate prairie as Cora Nichols placed the sealed envelope atop the growing stack inside her wooden chest. 16 letters now, each one bearing her heart and soul, each one destined to remain unread, unreceived, unanswered. She ran her fingertips across the latest envelope, feeling the slight bumps where her tears had dried on the paper as she'd written it. It was 1876, 3 years since she'd arrived in the dusty town of Redwater Springs, Wyoming Territory. 3 years since she'd fled the suffocating confines of Boston society, following the scandal that had nearly destroyed her family and the personal tragedy that had nearly destroyed her. The one-room cabin she called home sat on the outskirts of town, modest but hers. She'd purchased it with the last of her inheritance, determined to forge a new life far from the whispers and judgment of proper society. The cabin was simple: a bed, a table, a wood stove, and shelves lined with the books she'd brought west, her most precious possessions aside from her writing materials. At 25, Cora had resigned herself to a life of independence. The town regarded her with curiosity, the educated Eastern woman who kept to herself, who earned her living by teaching the children at the newly established schoolhouse. Few knew of her past, and she preferred it that way. As she closed the wooden chest containing her unsent letters, Cora glanced at the clock on her shelf. She had just enough time to prepare for the day's lessons. The letters were her secret ritual, her way of processing the emotions she couldn't share with anyone in Redwater Springs. Letters addressed to no one, bearing her fears, her hopes, her loneliness. Letters that would never be read, or so she believed. The schoolhouse bustled with activity as 20 children of various ages settled into their seats. Cora smoothed her simple calico dress and called the class to attention. Teaching brought her joy, the only real joy she'd known since coming west. The children's eagerness to learn, their uncomplicated view of the world, offered her a reprieve from her solitary existence. "Miss Nichols," little Emma Wilson's hand shot up. "Is it true there's a new cowboy in town?" The other children tittered with excitement. News traveled fast in Redwater Springs. "I wouldn't know, Emma," Cora replied evenly. "Now, let's open our readers to page 43. But the children's excitement was contagious, and Cora found herself curious despite her usual disinterest in town gossip. Redwater Springs existed as a supply stop for cattle drives and as a growing settlement for homesteaders seeking their fortunes on the frontier. Cowboys came and went with the seasons, their presence hardly noteworthy. As the day progressed, Cora couldn't help but notice an unusual level of activity in the main street visible through the schoolhouse windows. When she dismissed the children at the end of the day, she lingered a moment, watching as townspeople gathered outside the general store. Mrs. Wilson, the storekeeper's wife who occasionally shared town news with Cora, approached as she locked the schoolhouse door. "You must be wondering what all the fuss is about," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "Clayton O'Malley's returned." The name meant nothing to Cora. "I'm afraid I don't know who that is," she replied politely. Mrs. Wilson looked surprised. "Of course you wouldn't, dear. You arrived after he left. Clayton was born and raised here until about 5 years ago, went off to fight in the war, then stayed back east for a time before heading to Texas to work the cattle drives. His father, old Thomas O'Malley, passed last winter. Clayton's come back to claim the family ranch." Cora nodded, feigning interest while gathering her books. The lives of local ranchers held little relevance to her carefully constructed isolation. "He's quite handsome," Mrs. Wilson added with a knowing smile, "and unmarried." "I wish him well with the ranch," Cora said, cutting off the obvious matchmaking attempt. "Good day, Mrs. Wilson." As she walked home, Cora couldn't help but pass by the general store. The crowd had thinned, but a few men remained, gathered around a tall figure whose back was turned to her. Something about his posture, straight-backed yet relaxed, confident without arrogance, caught her attention. As if sensing her gaze, the man turned slightly, revealing a profile etched against the late afternoon sun. Cora quickened her pace, unwilling to be caught staring. She had no interest in cowboys or ranchers or any man for that matter. Her life was her own now, peaceful if lonely, and she intended to keep it that way. That evening, as she sat by the light of her oil lamp, she found herself reaching for her writing box. Another letter formed beneath her pen, but this one felt different. She wrote of the day's events, of the mysterious returning son, of her annoyance at Mrs. Wilson's transparent attempts at matchmaking. And as always, she wrote of the memories that haunted her, the ones she could never share. When she finished, she signed it as she always did. "Forever seeking peace, Cora." She sealed it, dated it, and added it to the chest with the others. The following morning dawned bright and clear. Saturday meant no school, and Cora looked forward to visiting the small lending library that operated from the back of the church on weekends. As she walked down the main street, a commotion near the livery stable caught her attention. A large chestnut stallion reared and bucked, nearly throwing its rider. The crowd scattered as the powerful animal spun in circles, dust billowing around its hooves. The rider, however, maintained his seat with remarkable skill, speaking in low, soothing tones that Cora couldn't make out from where she stood. Gradually, the horse calmed, and the rider dismounted in one fluid motion. He patted the animal's neck before turning to face the gathering of impressed onlookers. Cora recognized him immediately as the man from the previous day, Clayton O'Malley, presumably. He was taller than she'd realized, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped in the way of men who spent their lives in the saddle. His face was tanned from the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often. He wore no beard, just a shadow of stubble that emphasized a strong jaw. But it was his eyes that struck her most piercing blue, observant, intelligent. Those eyes found her in the crowd, and for a moment, Cora felt a jolt of recognition, though she was certain they'd never met. She nodded politely and continued on her way, unsettled by the encounter. At the library, Cora exchanged pleasantries with Reverend Porter and selected 2 novels she hadn't read. As she turned to leave, she nearly collided with a solid chest. "Pardon me, madam," came a deep voice touched with a hint of Texas drawl. Clayton O'Malley stood before her, hat in hand, those blue eyes even more disconcerting up close. "No harm done," she replied, stepping back to put appropriate distance between them. "You must be the schoolteacher," he said. "Miss Nichols, isn't it?" Cora was surprised he knew her name. "I am." "And you must be Mr. O'Malley." He nodded, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Clayton folks just got back to town after a long spell away." "So I've heard." Cora clutched her books tighter. "Welcome back to Redwater Springs." Something in his expression changed, a flicker of something that might have been recognition or perhaps curiosity. "Thank you kindly. I was hoping to speak with you actually." That caught her off guard. "With me, whatever for." Before he could answer, Reverend Porter called out to him. "Clay, come see these books your father donated before he passed. Thought you might want to have them back." Clay glanced at the Reverend, then back to Cora. "Another time, perhaps. Good day, Miss Nichols." He tipped his hat and moved away, leaving Cora puzzled by the brief exchange. What business could Clayton O'Malley possibly have with her? She watched as he examined the books the Reverend showed him, noting the care with which he handled them. Not what she expected from a rough cowboy. That night, she wrote another letter, this one filled with questions about the strange encounter and the unsettling way Clay O'Malley had looked at her, as if he somehow knew her. The following weeks brought a steady rhythm of school days and quiet evenings. Cora saw Clay O'Malley occasionally in town, at church on Sundays, at the general store purchasing supplies, once at the small restaurant where she sometimes took her Sunday dinner. Each time, he nodded politely, but made no attempt to approach her again. She told herself she was relieved, even as she found herself scanning crowds for his tall figure. She added 3 more letters to her chest during those weeks, each one less focused on her past and more on the present, on the curious feeling that her carefully constructed life was somehow shifting beneath her feet. It was late April when everything changed. A spring storm blew in unexpectedly, pelting the town with rain and hail. Cora had stayed late at the schoolhouse, grading compositions, and found herself caught in the downpour. She hurried home, holding her shawl over her head in a futile attempt to stay dry. As she approached her cabin, she saw a horse tied to the post outside, a familiar chestnut stallion. A figure rose from her porch, steps Clayton O'Malley, drenched from the rain, holding something against his chest to protect it from the weather. "Mr. O'Malley," she called out over the storm. "What are you doing here?" He stepped forward to help her up the steps, but she waved him off, fumbling with her key. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice barely audible above the thunder. "It's important." Propriety dictated she should send him away. A man at her home, alone, was scandalous even in the more relaxed social standards of the frontier. But the storm was worsening, and something in his expression told her this wasn't a social call. She opened the door and gestured him inside, leaving it ajar despite the rain to maintain some semblance of propriety. "You're soaked through," she observed, moving to light the stove. What was so urgent it couldn't wait for better weather? Clay stood awkwardly in the center of her small cabin, water dripping from his hat and coat onto her floor. She noticed he was still carefully protecting whatever he held against his chest. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said, his usual confidence seemingly diminished. But this couldn't wait any longer. He carefully set a bundle wrapped in oilcloth on her table. Cora approached cautiously, curious despite her discomfort at having him in her home. "What is this, Mr. O'Malley? Please call me Clay." He unwrapped the oilcloth to reveal a stack of envelopes tied with string. These are for you." Cora stared at the bundle, not comprehending. "For me? From whom?" Clay's expression was unreadable. "From me." She looked from the letters to his face, confusion evident. "I don't understand." "We've barely spoken." "They're replies," he said softly. "To your letters." The world seemed to tilt beneath Cora's feet. "My letters? What letters? I've never written to you." Clay ran a hand through his damp hair. "You wrote them, but you never sent them to anyone." A cold dread settled in Cora's stomach as understanding dawned. "How could you possibly know about those?" "Your cabin," he said, gesturing around them. "It was my father's hunting cabin before he gave it to the town to sell. I lived here for a time after the war before heading to Texas." Cora's mind raced. She'd purchased the cabin from the town council 3 years ago. "That doesn't explain how you know about my letters." Clay looked uncomfortable. "There's a loose floorboard under the bed. I used to hide things there, letters, keepsakes. When I came back and heard a schoolteacher was living in my old cabin, I wondered if my things were still here." Cora felt faint. "You came into my home without permission?" "No," Clay held up his hands. "No, I wouldn't do that. But about a year ago, my father wrote to me. Said he'd visited you about a school matter and noticed you'd placed something in that hiding spot. He recognized it because he knew I'd used it. He mentioned you were writing letters and storing them there." "Your father never mentioned this to me," Cora said, suspicious. "He wouldn't have." "Pa was observant. He saw things others missed. When I got his letter, I was curious. Not about your private matters," he added hastily, "but about whether you'd found the things I'd left behind." Cora crossed to her bed and knelt beside it, pushing it slightly to reveal the loose floorboard she'd discovered months after moving in. She'd thought it the perfect hiding place for her private letters. Clearly, she'd been wrong. "I never found anything here," she said, looking up at him. "And I still don't understand these." She gestured to the envelopes on the table. Clay's expression softened. "Pa wrote me again a few months later, said he'd seen you adding more letters, said you looked sad writing them, that they seemed important to you. He read the top one, I'm afraid." "He what?" Cora stood, outraged. "It had fallen out when you were putting them away. He didn't mean to pry, but once he saw what it was." Clay hesitated. "He sent it to me." Cora felt violated, exposed. Her most private thoughts read by strangers. That was unconscionable. "I know," Clay agreed, surprising her. "I told him as much in my reply, but then he sent another and another. Said you were writing to no one and everyone and that your words deserved answers." Cora felt tears stinging her eyes. "So you read them too, all of them?" "Only the ones Pa sent," Clay said quietly. 7 in all, and each time I wrote back, not to invade your privacy, but because—" He trailed off, struggling for words. "Because what you wrote touched something in me, made me feel like I knew you somehow." "But you never sent these replies," Cora said, indicating the stack on the table. "No, I never had the right. They were private thoughts you never meant to share. I kept them, telling myself I'd burn them someday, but when Pa died and I decided to come home." He shrugged. "I brought them with me." "Why give them to me now?" Clay met her gaze directly. because I've seen you around town these past weeks. You're exactly as I imagined from your letters, strong, kind, carrying some sorrow you won't share, and I realized I didn't just know you from those pages. I cared about you. Cora turned away, overwhelmed. You don't know me, Mr. O'Malley. A few stolen glimpses of my private thoughts don't constitute knowing someone. You're right, he conceded. And I'll leave now if that's what you want, but these belong to you. He gestured to the letters. Read them, burn them, that's your choice, but I couldn't keep them any longer. He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. The rain continued to pour outside. For what it's worth, I'm sorry for the invasion of your privacy, but I'm not sorry I read those letters. They changed me in ways I'm still discovering. With that, he was gone, back into the storm, leaving Cora alone with the mysterious bundle of replies. For a long time, Cora stood motionless, staring at the stack of letters on her table. Part of her wanted to throw them into the stove without reading a word. Another part, a stronger part, burned with curiosity. What had Clayton O'Malley written in response to her most private thoughts? Finally, she sat at the table and untied the string binding the envelopes. There were 7, each addressed simply to Cora and dated to correspond with her own letters. With trembling fingers, she opened the first one, dated nearly a year earlier. Dear Cora, it began in a strong, clear hand. You don't know me, and I have no right to these words of yours that have found their way to me. I should burn this letter your father found and forget I ever saw it. But I can't seem to do that, because in your words about loneliness and starting over, I recognized something of myself. Cora's breath caught. The letter continued, describing Clay's own feelings of displacement after the war, his struggle to find purpose, his decision to leave home and work the cattle drives. He wrote of nights under the stars, wondering if he'd made the right choice, if there was more to life than moving from place to place. I don't know what drove you from Boston, he wrote, but I understand the feeling of being a stranger everywhere, even in familiar places. Maybe especially in familiar places. If we ever meet, which seems unlikely, perhaps we'll recognize that quality in each other. She read the next letter, and the next, each one a thoughtful response to whatever her own letter had contained. He never directly quoted her words, respecting their privacy even in this strange correspondence, but she could tell which of her letters he was answering by the themes he addressed. In one, he wrote of his mother's death when he was 12, responding to Cora's letter about losing her own mother. In another, he described a sunset in the Texas Panhandle that had moved him to tears, echoing her confession that she sometimes wept at the beauty of the Wyoming landscape. The letters revealed a man of depth and sensitivity she would never have guessed at from their brief encounters. A man who read poetry and remembered his Greek mythology. A man who questioned his place in the changing West. A man who understood loss and resilience. The final letter was dated just 2 months ago. In it, Clay wrote of his father's death and his decision to return to Redwater Springs. Pa's last letter mentioned you again, he wrote. Said you continue to write your letters to no one and that you've grown even more beautiful but no less sad. I find myself wondering about the woman who's living in my old home, sleeping where I once slept, perhaps looking out at the same stars and asking the same questions about purpose and belonging. I've decided to come home to Redwater Springs to see about the ranch and settle Pa's affairs. And perhaps, if fate allows, to meet the woman whose words have become a strange comfort to me over this past year, though I doubt I'll ever have the courage to tell you about these letters. Cora set the last page down, her mind reeling. She felt exposed yet strangely understood in a way she hadn't been in years. Clayton O'Malley had glimpsed her soul through her private writings, and instead of judging her, he had responded with compassion and recognition. She stood abruptly, gathering the letters. She needed time to process this extraordinary situation. But as she moved to place the letters in her chest with her own, a knock came at her door. Clay stood there, still drenched, his expression uncertain. I'm sorry to disturb you again, but my horse has gone lame. The storm. He gestured helplessly. Cora hesitated only a moment before stepping back. Come in, Mr. O'Malley. It seems we have much to discuss. That night marked the beginning of a cautious conversation between two people who had already shared their deepest thoughts without ever speaking face to face. As the storm raged outside, Cora and Clay sat at her small table, a pot of coffee between them, and began the strange process of getting to know each other in person after their unusual introduction. "I should be furious with you," Cora said, wrapping her hands around her cup. "Those letters were never meant to be read," Clay nodded solemnly. "I know, and I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know I treated your words with respect, even if the way I came by them wasn't respectable. Your father," Cora began, then paused. "He never gave any indication he knew about my letters. Pa was good at keeping secrets," Clay said with a sad smile. "He mentioned in his letters that you seemed lonely but proud. He thought you might appreciate a friend but wouldn't accept one if offered directly." "He was perceptive," Cora admitted, "though I'm not sure I appreciate being analyzed." "What brought you to Redwater Springs?" Clay asked, changing the subject. "If you don't mind my asking," Cora considered deflecting, but it seemed pointless given how much he already knew. "Scandal," she said simply, "or rather fleeing one." Clay waited, not pressing. "My father was a respected professor at Harvard," she continued after a moment. "My mother died when I was 16 and he raised me alone. He encouraged my education at a time when many thought it inappropriate for women. I was engaged to a colleague of his, a promising young professor named Edward Harrington." She paused, the memory still painful despite the years that had passed. "3 weeks before our wedding, I discovered Edward had been systematically stealing my father's research and publishing it as his own. When I confronted him, he denied everything, claiming I'd misunderstood. But I had proof notes in my father's hand that appeared almost verbatim in Edward's published papers." "What did you do?" Clay asked quietly. "What any naive, righteous young woman would do," Cora said with a bitter smile. "I exposed him publicly at a faculty dinner. I thought the truth would prevail, but it didn't. No, Edward was well-connected, charming. He convinced everyone I was mentally unstable, distraught over wedding nerves. My father believed me, but by then his reputation was already damaged by association. He suffered a stroke shortly after and died within months." "I'm sorry," Clay said, and the simple sincerity in his voice touched her. "With my father gone and my reputation in tatters, there was nothing left for me in Boston. I used what remained of my inheritance to come west and start over where no one knew my name or my story. Until now," Clay said softly. Cora met his gaze. "Until now." They talked through the night as the storm gradually subsided. Clay spoke of his time in the war, of the nightmares that still occasionally plagued him. He told her about the cattle drives, the camaraderie among the cowboys, the long days in the saddle. He spoke of his father's declining health and his own reluctance to return home, fearing he'd been away too long to reclaim his place. "Why did you really come back?" Cora asked as dawn began to lighten the sky. Clay considered the question. "I told myself it was for the ranch. To honor Pa's memory. But I think part of me came back for those letters to find out if the woman who wrote them was as remarkable in person as she was on paper." "And," Cora asked, suddenly self-conscious. "She's more so," Clay said simply. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, Clay reluctantly stood to leave. His horse had rested through the night and appeared to have recovered from its lameness. "I should go before the town wakes up," he said, ever mindful of Cora's reputation. "But I'd like to see you again if you're willing." Cora walked him to the door, uncertain of her feelings but sure of one thing: Clayton O'Malley was unlike any man she'd encountered in Boston or the West. "I'm still processing all of this," she said honestly. "But yes, I think I'd like that." Clay nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take all the time you need. I'll be at the ranch when you're ready to talk again." As he mounted his horse, he turned back to her. "One more thing, Cora. Those letters you wrote, they saved me in ways you can't imagine. When I was at my lowest in Texas, thinking of giving up and drifting further west, your words reminded me that everyone struggles with purpose and belonging, that it's part of being human. Whatever happens between us now, I'll always be grateful for that." With that, he rode away, leaving Cora standing on her porch with more questions than answers, but also with a strange sense of possibility she hadn't felt in years. The following weeks brought a cautious courtship unlike any in Redwater Springs history. Clay began by sending Cora a formal note, inviting her to Sunday dinner after church. She accepted, and they dined at the town's small restaurant under the curious eyes of the locals. Their conversation that day was purposefully light, focusing on the schoolchildren's progress and Clay's efforts to restore the O'Malley ranch to productivity. But beneath the mundane topics ran an undercurrent of deeper understanding, built on the foundation of their unexpected correspondence. After dinner, Clay walked Cora home, maintaining a respectful distance that nonetheless felt intimate given what they already knew of each other's hearts. "I'd like to show you the ranch sometime," he said as they reached her cabin. "If you're interested," Cora smiled, "I'd like that. Perhaps next Saturday." And so it began a slow, deliberate getting to know you that was paradoxically both new and familiar. Each meeting revealed more of the person behind the letters, filling in the gaps that words on paper couldn't convey. Cora discovered that Clay laughed easily despite the sorrows he'd witnessed, that he had a talent for whittling beautiful figures from wood, that he treated his ranch hands with respect and fairness. She watched him gentle wild horses with patience and firmness, observed his kindness to children who flocked to him in town, noted how the older residents of Redwater Springs welcomed him back with genuine affection. For his part, Clay discovered Cora's quick wit, her passion for education, her surprising knowledge of astronomy. He admired her skill with the difficult parents of her students, her determination to build a proper school building in town, her quiet acts of charity for struggling families. Throughout their courtship, neither mentioned the original letters directly. They were a ghost presence, informing but not defining their growing relationship. Instead, they created new memories, new confidences, new understandings. Clay took Cora riding across the vast prairie, showing her hidden valleys and breathtaking vistas she'd never ventured to on her own. Cora introduced Clay to her favorite books, reading aloud to him on lazy Sunday afternoons on her porch. They attended town socials together, danced under the stars at a neighbor's wedding, worked side by side at the barn raising for a new settler. As summer bloomed across the Wyoming landscape, so did their feelings for each other. Yet both approached this new terrain with caution, aware of the unusual circumstances that had brought them together and the potential complications those origins might create. It was Cora who finally broached the subject one evening in late June. Clay had invited her to the ranch for supper, proud to show her the improvements he'd made to the house. After the meal, they sat on the wide porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "I've been writing letters again," Cora said suddenly. Clay turned to her, surprise evident in his expression. "Oh," she nodded, her gaze still on the horizon, "but these ones have an address and a recipient." She reached into her pocket and withdrew an envelope, offering it to him. "It's for you." Clay took it carefully, as if it might dissolve in his hands. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she said simply. "Read it now if you'd like." He opened the envelope and unfolded the single page within. Cora watched his face as he read, noting the play of emotions across his features: surprise, tenderness, and finally, a dawning joy. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Cora, is this truly how you feel?" she nodded, suddenly shy despite the boldness of her words on the page. "It is. I've been fighting it, telling myself it's too soon, that our beginning was too strange. But the truth is, I'm falling in love with you, Clay, not because of the letters or the past, but because of who you are now with me." Clay carefully refolded the letter and placed it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Then he reached for her hand. "I fell in love with your spirit first, through those letters," he admitted. "But these past months, getting to know the woman behind those words, her strength, her kindness, her courage, I've fallen in love with all of you, Cora. Every day reveals something new to admire, to cherish." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her fingers. "I never thought I'd find someone who understands me the way you do, who sees the man I'm trying to be, not just the one I've been." "It seems we found each other in the most unexpected way," Cora said softly. "Perhaps that makes it all the more precious." As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, Clay and Cora sat hand in hand. no longer needing words to express what had grown between them. The courtship that had begun in such unusual circumstances blossomed throughout the summer and into the fall. Clay became a regular visitor at the schoolhouse, sometimes bringing books for the children or helping to repair broken furniture. Cora spent weekends at the ranch, learning to bake bread in the large kitchen, riding across the expanding property as Clay pointed out his plans for the future. They exchanged new letters, two not secret ones, but open declarations of their feelings, their hopes, their dreams. Clay kept them tied with a blue ribbon in his desk drawer. Cora stored hers in a special box, separate from her old letters, which remained in their hiding place beneath the floorboard. As October painted the cottonwood trees golden along the creek banks, Clay asked Cora to accompany him on a special ride. They set out early one crisp morning, Clay leading the way to a destination he wouldn't reveal. After an hour's ride, they crested a hill to find a breathtaking view of the valley below, where the O'Malley Ranch sprawled alongside a winding river. A small table had been set up under a lone pine tree, complete with a checkered cloth and a picnic basket. "What's all this?" Cora asked, delighted by the surprise. Clay helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. "I wanted this moment to be special." He led her to the table, where he'd arranged not only a picnic but also a small wooden box. Clay took both of Cora's hands in his expression serious yet tender. "Cora Nichols, when I returned to Redwater Springs, I was searching for something I couldn't name. A purpose, a place to belong, perhaps. What I found was you." He squeezed her hands gently. "You've brought light back into my life in ways I never imagined possible." Cora felt tears gathering in her eyes as she recognized the direction of his words. "Clay, let me finish," he said softly. "I know our beginning was unusual. Some might even call it improper, but I believe those letters brought us together for a reason. They let us know each other's hearts before we ever spoke face to face. And every day since, I've fallen more deeply in love with the woman standing before me." He released one of her hands to reach for the wooden box, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Pa kept it for me, hoping I'd find someone worthy of it someday. Someone with strength and grace and a heart big enough to love even a broken cowboy like me." He took a deep breath. "Cora Nichols, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled freely down Cora's cheeks now. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Clay, I will marry you." Clay slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a tender kiss that sealed their promise to each other. When they finally parted, both were smiling through tears. "I have something for you too," Cora said, reaching into her pocket. She withdrew a small packet tied with string. "All the letters I never sent, from the day we met until now, I want you to have them to complete the circle in a way." Clay accepted the packet reverently. "Are you sure? These were private." "Not anymore," Cora said, touching his face gently. "Nothing about me is private from you now. These letters tell the story of falling in love with you, Clay. They belong with the man who inspired them." They spent the rest of the day on that hilltop, planning their future together. They would marry before Christmas, they decided. Cora would continue teaching until the end of the school year, then help Clay run the ranch full-time. They dreamed of children, of expanding the house, of building a life rich with love and purpose. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the valley, Clay helped Cora back onto her horse for the ride home. "I have one more surprise," he said as they set off. "A wedding present of sorts. Isn't it customary to wait until the wedding for such things?" Cora teased. Clay grinned. "This one couldn't wait. You'll see when we get back to town." When they reached Redwater Springs, Clay led Cora not toward her cabin but to a lot at the edge of town where construction had recently begun on a new building. To Cora's surprise, he dismounted and helped her down, then led her toward the wooden framework. "What is this?" she asked, puzzled. "Your school," Clay said proudly. "The town council approved the funds last month, but we've been keeping it quiet until we had the foundation laid." Cora stared in wonder at the beginnings of what would clearly be a proper schoolhouse larger than the current one-room building, with multiple windows for light and a bell tower rising from one end. "How did you manage this?" she asked, knowing the town's limited resources. Clay looked slightly embarrassed. I may have made a substantial donation and convinced a few of the other ranchers to contribute as well, but it was your ideas, Cora. The plans you drew up last spring, the ones you showed me but said were just dreams, I took them to the builder. Overwhelmed, Cora threw her arms around him. Thank you, she whispered against his chest, for believing in my dreams. Always, Clay promised, holding her close, just as you've believed in mine. News of their engagement spread quickly through Redwater Springs, met with general approval and more than a few knowing smiles from those who had watched their courtship unfold. Mrs. Wilson was particularly pleased, reminding Cora at every opportunity that she had mentioned Clay's good looks and bachelor status that very first day. The weeks leading up to their December wedding were busy ones. Clay worked to prepare the ranch house, adding a study for Cora with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a large desk where she could continue her writing. Cora divided her time between teaching, helping with the new schoolhouse construction, and preparing for her new life as Mrs. O'Malley. They decided to marry in the church, with Reverend Porter officiating. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, crowding into the small building to witness the union of their schoolteacher and returning son. Cora wore a dress of ivory silk that she'd ordered from Denver, with lace at the collar and cuffs. She carried a bouquet of pine branches and dried autumn flowers, the best that could be managed in the depths of Wyoming winter. Clay, handsome in a new black suit, watched with undisguised adoration as she walked down the aisle toward him. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When they exchanged vows, Clay surprised Cora by reciting his from memory, words he'd written himself that echoed phrases from their letters. Cora, too, had prepared her own vows, promising not only her love and fidelity but also her partnership in all his dreams and endeavors. As Reverend Porter pronounced them husband and wife, snow began to fall outside, dusting the town in a blanket of white that seemed to symbolize the fresh start they were making together. The celebration afterward was held in the town hall, with tables groaning under the weight of dishes contributed by every family in Redwater Springs. There was dancing and laughter, toasts and well wishes, a community coming together to celebrate not just a marriage but the promise it represented for their growing town. Late in the evening, as the party continued around them, Clay took Cora's hand and led her to a quiet corner. "Happy, Mrs. O'Malley?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she loved. "More than I ever imagined possible," she answered truthfully. "And you, I have everything I never knew I wanted," he said, drawing her close for a tender kiss. "A home, a purpose, and a wife who understands me better than I understand myself sometimes. All because of letters never meant to be read," Cora marveled, "and replies never meant to be sent," Clay added. "Perhaps the things we don't intend are sometimes the most important." That night, Clay brought his bride home to the ranch that would now be theirs together. As they crossed the threshold, he swept her into his arms, carrying her through the house that had been transformed by their love and their shared vision. In the bedroom, a fire crackled warmly in the grate, casting golden light across the quilt-covered bed. On the nightstand stood a small wooden chest, beautifully carved with intricate designs. "One last wedding gift," Clay said, setting Cora gently on her feet. "Open it." Inside, Cora found all the letters hers and his, the ones that had started their unusual journey together, arranged chronologically and tied with ribbons. "Our beginning," Clay said softly. "Preserved for us to remember, and perhaps someday to share with our children, so they'll know that love sometimes finds us in the most unexpected ways." Cora closed the chest and turned to her husband, her heart full to bursting with love and gratitude for the man who had read her unaddressed letters and responded with his whole heart. "Our beginning," she agreed, stepping into his embrace, "but not our end, not by a long measure." In the years that followed, the O'Malley Ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Clay's innovative ranching methods and Cora's sharp business mind proved to be a formidable partnership. The new schoolhouse was completed the following spring, with Cora continuing as teacher until the birth of their first child, Thomas, named for Clay's father. A daughter, Eleanor, followed 2 years later, and then another son, James. Their home rang with children's laughter and the ongoing conversations of two people who never tired of sharing their thoughts, their dreams, their hearts. Cora continued to write no longer secret letters, but stories for her children, articles for the territorial newspaper, and eventually a book about frontier education that gained recognition back east. Clay served on the town council, helped establish the first bank in Redwater Springs, and became known throughout the territory for his fair dealings and progressive ideas. Through it all, they maintained their practice of writing to each other notes slipped into pockets, letters left on pillows, words of love and encouragement that sustained them through difficult times and celebrated the joyful ones. On their 20th anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching their children play with the dogs in the yard, Clay took Cora's hand, his thumb brushing over the wedding ring that still adorned her finger. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" he asked. "If my father hadn't found those letters, or if I'd never written those replies," Cora considered the question, watching as Thomas, now a lanky teenager with his father's blue eyes, helped little Alina master the art of rope twirling. "I think we would have found each other anyway," she said finally. "Perhaps not as quickly, and certainly not with the same depth of understanding from the beginning, but souls meant to connect will find their way to each other, one way or another." Clay smiled, the lines around his eyes deepened by years of Wyoming sun and countless moments of laughter. "That's a lovely thought, that we were meant to be letters or no letters. The letters were our unique path," Cora said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "But the destination was always each other." As the sun set over the land they had nurtured together, casting the world in shades of gold and promise, Clay and Cora O'Malley sat hand in hand, their story still unfolding in the letters they continued to write, the love they continued to share, and the legacy they were building together in the heart of the West they both had come to call home. In the chest upstairs, alongside their wedding rings and their children's first locks of hair, the original letters remained the ones she wrote to no one, and the replies he never sent. Silent witnesses to the beginning of a love story that had started with words on paper, but had grown into a life written together, day by day, year by year, in the language of shared dreams and enduring love.